We're live.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining us. So we're joined here by three people who have been following the Julian Assange extradition effort extremely closely. Kevin Gosztola, the managing editor of Shadowproof, who's been covering this for years now. Stefania Maurizi is an investigative journalist who's also written a book about this, which will be translated into English pretty soon. I gather Stefania want to hear more about that soon. And Chip Gibbons, who's with Defending Rights and Dissent, and is covering the hearing for Jacobin. Chip, so today was the defense. Yesterday was the prosecution. What was the key difference between how you felt coming out of today and how you felt coming out of yesterday?
Yeah, so the prosecution went on for about 7 hours yesterday, and the defense got the last half hour, and today it was the opposite. The prosecution really seemed disorganized during its presentations. I was kind of surprised by it, whereas the defense was definitely much more organized. But the judges would sort of let the prosecution just ramble on for hours, and they would interject with the defense and ask questions. So I'm not really sure how to read it. I mean, my impression.
What was the tone? The tone of the interjections, like a hostile, skeptical tone, or more like
I would say
leading? Because sometimes you'll see judges who are on one side or another, they'll lead people in the right direction that they want other judges to hear or something. Was it that, or was it more like
they would question some of their suppositions, like the relevancy of this precedent, or at one point they interjected that 22 hours a day in a supermax was not a barrier to extradition or something like that. So I was a little bit taken aback. I mean, the main thing I would characterize about the prosecution is that their arguments are just sadistic, right? Because they've rejected all of the press freedom arguments, and we're now just hearing about Julian Assange's mental health and the oppressiveness of it. And the prosecution's really big on trying to undermine a psychiatrist's claims. At one point, they said Assange couldn't be suicidal or depressed because he watches TV. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I don't think that's a medical diagnosis. They said he couldn't be in solitary confinement if he could meet with his attorneys. And if you could yell at people through the wall, it wasn't solitary. And I'll read them later in this, but I've actually pulled up the UN definition of solitary confinement, and we can talk about that later on. And what Assange is facing meets under the United Nations minimum standard for treatment of prisoners as solitary confinement. But I'll let some of the other guests go on.
Yeah, Stefan, you can tell me a little bit about your book.
Oh, yes. So, Ryan, you have to realize that I have been working on the whole WikiLeaks documents since 2009. So 13 years of work, even before they were very famous, because they made a sensation with Collateral Murder, and that was in April 2010. So I had started before Collateral Murder. I work on all their documents. I work on Vault 7. So I know how it was to work on Vault 7. Very complex, the most tense work I have done, even more tense and difficult than the Snowden files. I work on with Glenn Greenwald on the Snowden files about my country, about Italy. In these 13 years, I have not just worked on the documents, but also on the case, because in 2015, I realized that no journalist had tried to get the documentation about the case. No one had ever filed a comprehensive freedom of information request in the US, in the UK, in Sweden, in Australia, to an extent that when I was asking to colleagues what the Swedish case, what the Swedish allegations were exactly, I could not get a precise, rigorous response. And everything was very confusing, everything lack of rigorous approach. So I was pretty upset. You have to realize, Ryan, that I'm a mathematician. So before journalism, I got a degree in mathematics, and for me, it's pretty important to have the facts rigorously exposed and collected and checked. So my book in my book, I put together all these 13 years of work on the WikiLeaks documents and all my FOIA work on the case. I'm not sure if you can hear me properly because I have a very bad background noise. Is it fine? Can you hear me?
Oh,
okay,
it went away.
Now it's gone.
Whoever did whatever they did, that worked.
I don't know. So I put together all these, and I put together the documents, the WikiLeaks revelations, the Freedom of Information request and litigation, because Ryan, it was not just about filing a Freedom of Information request. I had to litigate for 6 years in Britain, in Sweden, in US, in Australia, and it has been really hard to keep together 7 lawyers, 7 for yellow. So I put together all this, and I tell reconstruct this investigation with a narrative style, because it's you can have the best, most rigorous, factually correct book, but if you don't have a pleasure when you're reading it, it's useless. So the narrative style really important for me. In Italy, it's doing very well, and to an extent that we have now the 3rd edition. So let's hope in the UK and US and in the English version will be okay, will be widely read. I hope so. I mean,
And Kevin, what was your key takeaway from today?
Well, yeah, so I think a critical question to ask right now is whether the High Court of Justice recognizes the gravity of what is going on and what has happened within the United States government, because it was put in this way by Mark Summers. Mark Summers, one of the attorneys who are on the Assange legal team. He put it this way, that he believes, or he contended that this is the first time that the US government has requested that a UK court exercise jurisdiction over an individual who was the target of a US agency that wanted to poison or plotted to kill him, drew up plans to kill Julian Assange. And I don't know that the High Court, in the afternoon, Mark Summers took some time to talk about the Yahoo News report and he did a summary of the revelations in that. And he connected it back to the evidence that is in the court record. So this material in the Yahoo News report is not evidence in the extradition case, technically speaking. But he connected it back to the Spanish security company, UC Global, which Stefania can talk a bit about that because she's actually a target and somebody who has testified in that criminal case. But he connected it back to the Spanish security company and the way that they targeted Assange, his legal team, and his family. And he just basically asked the court to recognize the record of hostility and to then pair that with these assurances. I put the assurances in quotes that have been brought forward by this US government to try and salvage a case after they lost. And it's the position of Julian Assange's team that assurances should have been put forward before the ruling by the district judge. I know that could be a matter for legal debate, but it actually makes a lot of sense that if you were concerned that the judge was going to rule against your decision because of how the defendant would be treated in your country, that then you would tell the judge, well, we assure you that we are going to place this individual into a federal medical center, or we assure you that we will make certain that this person is not put into restrictive confinement conditions that would result in a deterioration of their mental health. They didn't do that. There's a lot of conversation about special administrative measures, and whether he would be put in a supermax prison. And Gordon Kromberg, the assistant U.S. attorney in this case from the Eastern District of Virginia, where this case would be tried if Julian Assange was brought to the U.S. and put on trial, he left it open. He said it was possible that Julian Assange could be put under SAMs, this thing that would be authorized by an attorney general.
You mean at the hearing or in a different setting?
Yeah, at the extradition hearing. So the problem with Gordon Kromberg was also addressed by the defense team multiple times, which is Gordon Kromberg should really honestly should be a witness in these proceedings. He should have been called to testify and to be cross-examined, but he never was. And these declarations that were entered in, it's testimony that the defense team was never able to test. They're never able to test his assertions. The only thing they were able to do was call their own expert witnesses and put the declarations, these statements by Gordon Kromberg to these people who have worked on these issues in terms of like prisoners' rights issues or whether they worked as defense attorneys themselves. And obviously that's not as impactful and persuasive for a judge as hearing from the person and having them confront their own statements and defend what they're saying. So Gordon Kromberg's able to say these ridiculous things about solitary confinement, like what Chip said, and the judge just has to accept that because he's not there in the courtroom for the defense to question.
How did the court respond to talk about the Yahoo News story? And Chip, let me get your take on that, and I'd like to hear your other
Kevin,
take of Stefania and Kevin too.
Kevin, what was your reaction to them on the Yahoo News story? I couldn't get a really good read. I'm curious if you could get one.
No.
No read?
No, not really.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, see, that's why I say I don't think that they really appreciated the gravity of the issue, because this is hugely significant. I mean, what we're talking about, these are things that, first of all, let me just say that the most dedicated supporters who have been out there in front of, whether you're talking about the magistrate's court or this Royal Court of Justice today, these people who have done demonstrations, have mobilized city by city on, let's say, Assange's birthday or whenever they've had these organizing events in order to get people's awareness raised about what's going on with Assange. There are things that are a part of this case that they really want desperately for the judicial system in the UK to recognize, and they just won't. I mean, there's the fact, alongside with the CIA, there's the factor that the FBI has this allegation that comes from a witness, Siggy Tordarson, who's in jail right now because he's committing financial fraud schemes in Iceland, and they have to jail him to stop him from committing further crimes. And he's a sociopath and a pedophile, and he's somebody who recanted what he had said to the FBI that became a part of the indictment. But that doesn't get addressed in these proceedings. You know, we have the FBI confiscating or seizing material from the Ecuador authorities that are private, confidential archive materials that Julian Assange owned. And I think they included not only, records related to his handling of the WikiLeaks publications, but also medical notes, etc. And those are now in the custody of the U.S. government because they seized them. But we don't talk about this, this corruption, the amount of corruption and the extent to which, really and truly, nobody from the U.S. government really is cross-examined or has to be tested in the course of this. I mean, that just doesn't seem to have any impact on the trajectory of these proceedings.
And this is unfortunately very common with legal proceedings. I've covered a lot of appeals in the US and stuff, and people get really animated about them because there's these really intense issues. In this case, I mean, Julian Assange is being murdered before our eyes, and you have this really profound press freedom issue, not just about the First Amendment in this country, but he's an Australian who was in Europe reporting on U.S. war crimes, and they want to extradite him. And then you get these legal proceedings that are deciding the fate of this human being, are deciding the fate of the First Amendment, are deciding the fate of people around the world's right to through journalism, through truth telling, resist U.S. militarism and empire. And like the discussion in the court is like, here's this legal test that has 5 factors about extradition. Did the judge apply those 5 factors correctly? And there's just such a disconnect between the sort of obscure, very dry legal arguments that are taking place and what's really at stake. And as someone who has reported on a lot of appellate arguments in the U.S., I always try to like stress that juxtaposition. Like, yeah, they're talking about, does this need strict scrutiny or rational basis, or is this the right test or not? But like, we're talking about surveillance. We're talking about persecuting Muslims. We're talking about force feeding people at Guantanamo. We're talking about whether or not someone's going to be executed, right? But it all comes down to these dry, arcane legal arguments where you wouldn't think they were making life or death decisions about a person, nonetheless life or death decisions about the First Amendment. Or press freedom. They're overseas, right? And part of that is because the judge at the district level rejected all of the press freedom claims and made this ruling based on the idea that Assange's extradition to the U.S. would be oppressive, which I think that's a just ruling. I think that's a correct ruling, the oppressive part, but she should have also found for the press freedom arguments. So you're getting like, what is the correct case law in the UK extradition and its 5-pronged factors, and did the judge really apply those factors? While we're talking about someone who we can see on camera who has deteriorated, and we know the CIA tried to kill him. We know the FBI lied to the minister of Iceland in order to enter the country, telling them they had to come and stop an imminent hacking attack, and instead they were spying on WikiLeaks, and then Iceland kicked them out of the country. They kicked them out for lying. And all of these big picture issues, and we're sitting there either talking about the Turner test or we're doing this sadistic character assassination of an eminent psychiatrist who had the audacity to take a preliminary step to protect the identity of Stella Moores, right? In his first preliminary report, he does not report Stella Moores as Julian Assange's partner. He mentions Assange has a partner with 2 children, and he mentions Stella, but he doesn't mention Stella Moores is his partner with 2 children. And he went to get advice about what to do with that because he thought she'd be threatened by UC Global and the CIA if he revealed this. And by the time it gets to the court already knows this. It's in his second report. He gives the prosecution his interview notes, and the prosecution is just trying to use this to say he wasn't impartial. He should be disqualified. Then they come up and say, hey, guess what? He told the British Journal of Psychiatry he prefers to protesting working within the system to advance justice. Like, oh my God, working within the system to advance justice, that must mean he's biased. I guess he has a pro-justice bias. I don't know what the bias is here, and it's just such a shocking.
You would think the Justice Department would say, "Hey, I guess he's on our side."
Well, as Kevin pointed out,
working for justice.
As Kevin's pointed out before, this guy has served as a witness for the Crown prosecution before, right? He's not. He's well respected by both sides, and now they're suddenly upset that he believes he should work within the justice system to advance justice.
And Chip, I think this is a key point for people to take away, which is that even though this is the biggest, press freedom case of the century, it's not being decided even remotely on the question of press freedom. Like, so if he wins his appeal, that's good for him, and it is a win for press freedom in the sense that he wins. But it's not as if the court will have declared itself on the side of press freedom. If he loses, same thing. But the fact they're not considering press freedom is kind of already a major loss for press freedom. And Stefania, to that point, I want to hear tell us more about this, the way that you've been targeted, because this Yahoo News story was explosive. It was excellent, but it and what it revealed was new. But some of the things that it revealed were already, in pattern evident from like Chip said, a lot of the court documents and a lot of things that were already known. So I'm not saying it didn't advance the ball, but we did know that this type of thing was going on, and this, your experience, I think, dovetails with that. And sorry, it's loud here.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan, We could expect targeting, but of course, we could not expect such lawless activities. And I was really shocked. I was really shocked, and let me tell you, I lost my faith on the Crown Prosecution Service while litigating my Freedom of Information Act because of the documents I obtained, and I will clarify later on. Let me tell you about the targeting. So in November 2017, I went to the embassy in order to discuss, in December 2017, actually. I went to the embassy because I had discovered the destruction of very important documents about the Julian Assange case by the Crown Prosecution Service. Actually, when litigating my Freedom of Information request in the UK, in London, before the London Tribunal, I discovered gaps in this documentation about the correspondence between the Crown Prosecution Service and the Swedish prosecutors about the Swedish extradition attempt. So there were gaps. The Crown Prosecution Service had told me and my lawyers that they had provided the full documentation about the case, but there were clear gaps in this documentation. So we asked the Crown Prosecution Service, my lawyers and I asked the Crown Prosecution Service for these documents, and only at that point they admitted they had destroyed crucial documents about this case, even if it was ongoing, highly controversial, and high profile. So I discovered this in November 2007, and I went to the embassy in December 2017. I went there, and something very unusual happened. Usually I could access the embassy just with my backpack, with my notes, all I was asked was to handle my mobile phones to the security. But in that occasion, they confiscated everything. I was not even allowed to go to meet Julian Assange with a pen. So I could not conduct an interview for my newspaper, La Repubblica. At that time, I was working for the Italian daily La Repubblica. So it was highly unusual, the whole thing. I wanted to discuss many different things. And among these things, I wanted to discuss how we had discovered this destruction of documents. And I realized something was wrong. These security guards were behaving in a completely different way with respect to the past. I had visited Julian Assange many, many times in the embassy, and they never, ever confiscated me anything. So I was pretty upset about this. And later on, in 2019, I discovered that they had targeted me. They had recorded my conversation. They had filmed my meeting with Julian Assange. They had accessed all my electronic devices. They had unscrewed my phones. I had dumb phone, an encrypted phone, and I had other devices. They took pictures. I have no idea why they took pictures. And I had realized there was some problem because I had disruption in my communication. So when my editors were calling me, for some reason they were unable to reach me, and they were telling me, why you don't reply to our emails, our SMS, our text messages, and our emails? Why you are not replying to our call? And they said, I never had any call. I never had any SMS on my mobile phone. I never had any email on my inbox. So I realized there was some problem with my communications, and this has been going on for a while, but in particular in 2017, 2018, and it came out, the UC Global story, that I realized how badly I was targeted, and in fact I filed a criminal complaint in Madrid. And I hope the Spanish investigators will try to find evidence, because it's pretty upsetting what happened. I have no idea whether I was targeted in other ways. I mean, I hope I was not. I was working on Vault 7, and it was I wrote 15 articles based on Vault 7. And, it was very, very important, absolutely in the public interest. I don't want to go into the technical details why, but it's a matter of fact that Libération, the French newspaper, reported on it. Mediapart reported on it. Der Spiegel reported on it. Süddeutsche Zeitung reported on it. So it's a matter of fact that some prominent news organization found it publicly relevant. So we wonder whether we were also targeted. And if not, it's a scandal that they targeted a publisher for publishing what we publish as well. We were part of the publication operation. These documents were not dumped on the internet. It was heavily redacted. We also advised them when there was need to redact documents. We made sense of this highly technical information. So it was proper journalistic work, and it was definitely not a dump. So it's madness that the CIA tried to kill them for doing this kind of journalistic work. It's a scandal. I really don't understand why there is not, kind of public outrage about this.
And Kevin, can you add a little bit to that of what specifically they also did to Assange himself in the way of surveillance and other evidence that we have that any attempts to deny this are going to run up against. And then we also have a question from the comments that Louis says, I was hoping Julian would be able to go home today. What is the next court date? So in other words, like what's the next step in this process? Is the next step a ruling, or will there be another hearing before another ruling? Okay.
So let me work backwards to the CIA first. If I could get some assistance, I'd like to put this up on the screen here so people can see the extent of the punishment by process that is ongoing in this case. This is an image from from Consortium News that they grabbed, but it's actually from an Australian attorney named Kelly Tranter. Actually, I think she's on the Assange team. It says Assange Australian lawyer Kelly Tranter. And they made this map that shows the different paths that this case can take now. It's going to be hard for people to see, but I'll just let people know for their own benefit, if they want to blow this up and look at it more closely, that it's available on Consortium News. But you can see here that we're not done. We've got so much time left in this case. And just even with, first off, awaiting this appeal, we left today with no knowledge whatsoever of when the High Court is going to rule on this. I could tell people November, I could tell people December, but that's just a guessing game on my part. That's just me believing that it's not going to take much longer than it took for the district court to rule. But who knows? As the High Court of Justice said themselves, they have other cases, there are other applications they're reviewing. It could take some time. It's a highly complex case. They may want to take additional time to weigh the evidence that I don't know how long they've been able to focus and look at until this point. So then if they rule against Julian Assange, it's important to note that then it flips and it's going to go to the Supreme Court and they'll appeal there. If the US government doesn't get the outcome they want with it, which is the overturning of the decision, then they're going to appeal to the Supreme Court. If the High Court rules that there's an issue that needs to be deliberated over again and they want to send it back down to the district court for a judge at the lower level to review this case again, then it goes back there and we start all over. We start this whole thing over of it taking a year to a year and a half to get to maybe proceedings, or I don't know exactly how it would work, but it seems like there's a set of preliminary plannings that would have to take place before we had the hearing where we all tuned in. And what they want to do, if they accept the assurances, the diplomatic assurances that are being offered by the US government, is this is the defense team, and I think they're well within their right to make this request. They want to be able to call witnesses and cross-examine and test those assurances and show the judges why they should not trust the U.S. government to make these claims about how they would treat Julian Assange humanely and how in these conditions he would not be at risk due to his mental health. So that what I've outlined there is a very complex future, but it's also a dark, bleak future for Julian Assange, because what it means is somebody who's 50 years old, who has a lot of health issues right now and did not look well, is probably looking at 2 to 3 years more in custody of either the UK government, because he's so far been denied bail and they won't allow him bail, and they won't allow him bail. And this is going to get to the issue of the CIA very briefly here. They won't allow him bail because he has a bail jumping charge on his record. And that bail jumping charge, we learned from the Yahoo News report, was left there by the UK government in order to help the US pursue this prosecution. It was left there as a pretext, something in which the authorities, the Metropolitan Police, could use as a justification to go and arrest him and a justification for keeping him in jail. And now it is an albatross around his neck. It is the thing that is keeping him from being free from jail, because the prosecutors will go before any court and claim that he will try to be a fugitive from justice. You know, they don't recognize the institution of political asylum. They'll say that if we let him out of jail, he might try to go seek asylum from another country. And they use that. They used Mexico during the bail hearing that we had. They said, oh, the Mexico president's talking favorably about Assange and said he would be open to giving Assange asylum. We can't let Assange escape to the Mexican embassy and try to leave this country. So we have to keep him at Belmarsh High Security Prison. You know, the things that we found from the story that are about the targeting was this disruption campaign, you know, the way in which it essentially confirms they're planting false information. They're trying to turn and pit people against each other. The way in which they are intruding upon people's personal devices, the way it acknowledges that they were trying to steal people's personal electronics. I mean, we know that from the coverage that El País did in those documents, the way and they looked over documents that they had access to, which Stefania Maurizi is you've also been able to access and read as well, I believe, that it says that they tried to steal the phone battery of Ellen Nakashima when she visited. That when she went there to the security checkpoint, this employee of UC Global actually recorded. I don't know why you'd put this in writing, but actually recorded that he wanted to take it from Ellen, and she's the national security reporter for the Washington Post. And when she asked for it back, he was like, well, I have to give it to you. You asked for it. So he records that he did not keep the cell phone battery of Ellen Nakashima. So they're doing all these things. They're invading people's electronics so that they could set them up as tracking devices or whatever they would like to do to be able to intrude upon them later. They're tailing and following Baltazar Garzón, this member of the Assange legal team, who is actually features in the U.S. state embassy cables that were published by Assange, because he's involved in trying to pursue this theory that the Bush administration officials could be put on trial in Spain for the war crimes that they committed, which the U.S. won't hold them accountable for committing. So this Yahoo News report, I do think, I want to say this finally, that I believe that this Yahoo News report is a tribute to what happened this week with the press attention. There were more people than ever before on this video feed. I mean, Stefania can attest to it. Yeah. There were more people than during the extradition hearing itself, when witnesses were being called, like Daniel Ellsberg and Noam Chomsky was submitting a statement. And there were reasons why people would find this to be like news. No, this 2-day appeal hearing that wasn't even on the core fundamental press freedom issues. We had over 70 people on the video feed. Take 10 away who were probably like Justice Department bureaucrats from the UK and the US. And they're all and members of legal teams. You've got 50 plus people on there who are journalists from around the world, including the United States, court reporters who I hadn't seen tune into this before. And that's because of the Yahoo News report. I mean, Michael Isikoff was following. I expect that there will be some kind of a report that Yahoo News tries to put together, perhaps following up with their sources. Who knows? But for the first time, Michael Isikoff was on there following. So that is owed to the work that was done by them on the CIA issue.
Okay. And Chip, can you talk a little bit about what you were saying earlier about the solitary and the assurances and what kind of assurances they made? Because as I continue to read their assurances, they say, we promise we won't, put him in any of these SAMs unless we decide that we will.
Sure. I mean, the assurances have so many holes in them that you could drive a truck through them, right? But one of the cases that the attorneys made very strongly was that even if you remove the issue of the SAMs, even if you remove the issue of ADX Florence, this is the notorious prison they're afraid he'll be put in, he's still most likely to be put in prolonged isolation. Julian Assange, if he is extradited to the Eastern District of Virginia, will be held most likely at the Alexandria Detention Center. Chelsea Manning was held there when she was resisting the grand jury. Paul Manafort was actually held there at one point. It was not the prison he was at where people were complaining he was too nice for treatment. It was the one where he was put in solitary confinement. Daniel Hale was there. 2 people have killed themselves at this prison. And Defending Rights in Dissent, where I work, had a lot of experience with this jail when Chelsea was there. And, they kept saying he won't be put in solitary confinement. He will be put in administrative segregation. In 2014, 2013, I was doing work on the local level in Maryland on solitary confinement. And one of the things we were always warned about is that prison officials will use various euphemisms, segregated housing unit, administrative segregation is the most common. In the juvenile context, sometimes they'll say reflection cottage, which is really disturbing to me, putting kids in solitary and saying you're sending them to the reflection cottage. But the prosecution was doing this same thing. I was having flashbacks to my time at the ACLU of Maryland, just being like, it's not solitary, it is administrative segregation. And if you look at the Mandela rules, the Nelson Mandela rules, also known as the United Nations minimum standards for treatment of prisons, which were adopted by the UN General Assembly, it says, Rule 44, for the purpose of these rules, solitary confinement shall refer to the confinement of prisoners for 22 hours or more a day without meaningful human contact. Prolonged solitary confinement shall refer to solitary confinement for a time period in excess of 15 consecutive days. And I have in front of me the letter, and we did 2 things with Chelsea Manning. We sent a letter to the sheriff because even though it's a federal case, it's a local jail, so the sheriff of Alexandria is the man in charge, as well as, and we couldn't talk about it at the time, but we can talk about it now, we sent a confidential communication along with the ACLU and some other human rights groups with Chelsea's lawyer's authorization, alerting them about her conditions. And coincidentally, perhaps, the very same day we sent this communication that they took her out of ADSEG. But here is the letter describing her conditions. I'm not going to read all of it, but it mentions that, we are aware your officials have denied Manning's being held in solitary confinement and claim that you don't have solitary confinement. Instead, she's being held in administrative segregation, right? This is the big claim. However, in administrative segregation, Manning has been held in isolation for up to 22 hours a day and only permitted to leave her cell between the hours of 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. She has been denied contact with others being detained, denied access to the law library and reading materials. And then we note the international definition of solitary confinement. And then we note that the special rapporteur has said that prolonged solitary confinement is always constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. And in some cases, it may even constitute torture. So there is zero question that administrative detention or segregation is solitary confinement under the international definition passed in the Nelson Mandela rules by the UN General Assembly. And there is zero question that what they will do to Assange, what they're even claiming they will do, will constitute under international law cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, and depending on the effects of it, could constitute torture. And I will just flat out state what they will do will be torture. In Assange's case, given his mental state, it will qualify as torture. And we've seen Chelsea Manning detained there. We've seen Daniel Hale detained there. We know what this looks like. So even if you take away the SAMs, even if you take away the Supermax prison, you know, they're still saying, oh, he's just going to be in administrative segregation. That is solitary. That is torture. That is a crime that they are plotting to commit against Julian. And no one seems very disturbed about that on the British court. It's just disgraceful that someone would get up there and say it isn't Gordon Kronberg, this awful prosecutor who was one of the ones involved in the abuses of Samuel Airing. Intercept, Ryan, your publication did a great profile of him, involved in Daniel Hale, you know, sent some letters saying, well, it's not solitary confinement because he can meet with his lawyer for legal meetings and he can yell through the windows and the doors at other prisoners. You're in a single cell by yourself for 22 hours a day, but you're not in solitary confinement because you can yell through a door. I mean, I can't imagine being so morally debased as to stand up in a court and say that. I would be ashamed of myself. This is justifying torture, and it's disgraceful.
Kevin, while you were watching the hearing yesterday and today, were there any moments where you thought, from the prosecution's perspective, oh wow, like they just really put the case away there, like Assange is screwed with that? Like, or were there any or were there moments where the defense put out a point where you're like, there's just no way they can surmount this?
Yeah, I'll keep this short because I want to make sure Stefania gets back in here. But the thing that really stunned me was the High Court asked this question, which I think is it's okay, and I understood the point. But then James Lewis, the lead prosecutor from the Crown Prosecution Service, who has been, you know, really the face of this operation in the UK, he decides that he's going to run with it. So the High Court says, well, what if he's acquitted? You know, what if he doesn't go to SAMS or ADX Florence after he's convicted because he was acquitted of these charges? And James Lewis is like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. And he runs with it and says these things that made absolutely no sense if you know anything about the way Espionage Act prosecutions are handled in a US court. So he says they could apply for speedy trial. I have no idea what that is. I've been following this. I don't know how you would do that in the course of an Espionage Act prosecution, because there are all sorts of considerations that have to be made for taking care of classified information or sensitive materials that are at issue in the case. There are usually, and there will be with this case, dozens of what they call stakeholders who are supposedly like the custodians of the records. So you have to ask them what you could declassify or what you could use in the trial when bringing forward this criminal case. So I don't know how you apply. The only way you get speedy trial is if you plead out or you get a plea agreement from the Justice Department. And I don't really think at this point they're going to be bargaining with Julian Assange like they, they didn't want to do it with Daniel Hale, but you know, you're just not going to get a CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou scenario where they plead out to 30 months or something like that. So there's no speedy trial. And then they start talking about, well, you could challenge it on First Amendment grounds. No, I don't think so, because there aren't any cases before that where defendants have succeeded in challenging the constitutionality of the Espionage Act. So I don't really know what James Lewis is talking about, because he says then they'll challenge it on First Amendment grounds, and then they'll say, oh yeah, you can't bring these charges, they violate the First Amendment, and then he'll just walk free. The thing is, the way that they're drawn up and the way they won't acknowledge that Julian Assange is a journalist, it's supposed to be airtight so that they can go after Julian Assange and make this case. And we knew that could happen, which is why everyone was clamoring and begging Eric Holder not to bring charges against Julian Assange when he was Attorney General. And in fact, they decided not to do that. So I don't know what James Lewis is talking about. That was one of the more baffling moments for me.
And Stefania, you've spent so much time with him in the past. What was what was your reaction to seeing him? This is we interviewed Gabriel Shipton, his brother, this morning, and he said that he hadn't seen him for almost a year, and it looked like he had aged 5 years. What was your impression of how he's doing? And can you talk about
how Julian is doing? How Julian Assange is doing? I was really shocked, Ryan. Let me say, having worked so many years, I have seen him in all sorts of situations. When he was under house arrest initially at the very beginning in 2010, 2011, he was doing badly. He lost a lot of weight and so on, but it was pretty okay. Then when he was in the embassy, at the beginning, I realized his health started collapsing. I can tell you, everyone, I think, remember when he was arrested. He was dragged out of the embassy, and he was carrying a book, History of a National Security State, which was based on interviews with Gore Vidal by Paul Jay, one of the founder of the Real News Network. I had given him that book as a present, and I was mentioning him that Gore Vidal was living in Italy, in the Amalfi Coast, and this beautiful Mediterranean Sea. So at a certain point, I noticed that Julian had closed his eyes, and I asked, why you are closing your eyes? And he said, because I'm trying to remember how it was to be outside of a building and in open space close to the sea. I'm trying to remember. He didn't remember how it was to go to the sea and to be free. So it was really sad to realize how his health was collapsing day after day. And the worst was when I saw him. I met him for the last time in November 2018, before his arrest, just 5 months before he was arrested. And he was really in bad shape, to an extent that I wrote a very desperate message to my editors at La Repubblica. I sent an email saying, he's dying, he's lost so much weight, he's really dying. But this is nothing compared to how he appeared during this appeal hearing. He was dangerously thin. He has aged so much, and he appeared heavily medicated. So I was really upset. I was really sad. Really, I don't know, Ryan. I really lost faith in all this system, because I saw him trying to find a place to be protected, and he found nothing. He tried with the UN, he tried with asylum. Then he tried with the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Then he tried with the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and nothing has been able to stop his destruction. Nothing. And this tells you a lot about our societies. Is what they are doing is what they are doing to him is completely unacceptable, I believe. I have no trust. Let me tell you, let me be very straightforward. I have no trust whatsoever in the Crown Prosecution Service, because I have been litigating my Freedom of Information request with the Crown Prosecution Service, and I have evidence of how they have contributed to create this legal and diplomatic quagmire, which has destroyed him and finally resulted in his arrest. So this was the Crown Prosecution Service in the Swedish case. How can you trust them that in the U.S. extradition they will do better? They have never ever released me a single page of their correspondence with the U.S. Never ever. They just released me a few pages about their correspondence with the Swedish prosecutors, nothing else. So I wonder why they don't want to release their correspondence with the US authorities. I imagine if that correspondence was just ordinary correspondence, just bureaucratic correspondence, they would release it. So I'm sure that documentation is dynamite. And that's the reason why they don't release it, and not even a single page of that correspondence. So I have no trust in the legal process, absolutely no trust.
So I know that people have to go pretty soon, but I wanted to give everybody a chance if they wanted to, to say one last, offer one last observation. Chip, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, the Julian Assange case is extraordinarily important for press freedom, which is why Defending Rights in Dissent has been involved in it. These Espionage Act prosecutions that we've seen against whistleblowers, starting with Daniel Ellsberg and then being normalized under the Obama and then just Trump running with it, have had a really grave impact on press freedom, where you put sources in jail and crossing the Rubicon into now we're going to put the publisher, now we're going to put the journalist in jail is really, really disturbing. And it's not just the legal war on Assange that's disturbing. It's the extra legal war as well, right? It's not just the 17 counts under the Espionage Act. It is the FBI flying to Iceland under false pretenses. It is the CIA declaring them a non-state hostile intelligence agency so they can avoid congressional and White House oversight. It's them plotting to kill him. It's UC Global. I mean, the war on against Julian Assange is just unfathomable. I think back to this quote from a Roosevelt administration official about the 27-year saga to deport the labor leader Harry Bridges, and how sometimes the government just becomes so fixated on someone and just destroying them that they just keep going and going at it. And even the people involved don't remember why. And it's sort of similar to that with Assange. I mean, since he exposed the U.S. empire for what it is, they have been waging this vendetta against him. They've pursued prosecutions. They've used the FBI. They've used the CIA. They've used private contractors. And it is part of a larger war against the truth.
Kevin, you want to?
Yeah. So first, thanks Defending Rights in Dissent for putting this together. Really good to be able to talk with everyone here about what was going on in this appeal hearing and how concerning it is. Just a small point, and then a larger point. There were unindicted co-conspirators in the latest version of the indictment that was issued before the extradition hearing. I think that's worth noting, as Stefania talks about why the UK government doesn't want to give up these files, or why Ecuador wouldn't want to give up files, why the US government is going to give up files. I mean, the US government is going to say it's because there's an ongoing case and everything is relevant. But the reason why they don't really want us to have access is because there are other people who were targeted as well. And it's alluded to. I mean, they're tracking Sarah Harrison as she helps Edward Snowden as he's trying to escape Hong Kong and hopefully get to a place where he could secure asylum. And then he became stuck in the Moscow airport. So it's important to consider the others who have been associated with WikiLeaks, who have had targets put on their back in addition to Julian Assange, just for being involved in this work at some level. And even to some degree, Stefania's likely been threatened to some extent just because of the nature of being involved in this journalism. And finally, what I'll say is it's really disheartening that Attorney General Merrick Garland won't drop these charges. It's really disheartening to me, too, that he was before both of the Senate committees. And unless you've seen something that I haven't, Ryan, it's my sense that not a single senator has questioned Merrick Garland during these committee hearings and asked him about this Assange prosecution, even though it is such a high profile case. It's received so much condemnation from human rights and press freedom organizations, and yet there's silence. And that's the way they want it to be. They won't answer questions from reporters. They don't believe they have to take responsibility for any of this. They want to pretend like it's unfolding and there's nothing to see here. And there's no reason for anybody to get worked up and be upset. And I think that's why it's good that we're having these conversations, and why Chip, Stefania, myself, other organizations that had credentials. I think that's why it's really, really good that they're putting out reporting and calling people's attention to it, because I only think the only way we're really going to break this long-term trajectory we're on, where Julian Assange is in prison for, in a jail for another 3 to 5 years, is by shaming and forcing some kind of a response from the Biden administration.
Yeah, Stefania, any last thoughts?
Yes. So first of all, thank you. I completely agree with Kevin when he mentioned Sarah Harrison and other WikiLeaks journalists. And once again, my Freedom of Information request and litigation provide confirmation, because the UK authorities at the Scotland Yard are denying me access to their files, to the files about Sarah Harrison, Joseph Farrell, Christine Ruffson, using national security exemption to fight terrorism. Even if they Scotland Yard acknowledge that they are journalists, they are using national security laws to fight terrorism against them. So it is pretty upsetting that 20 years after the 9/11 are using national security laws to fight terrorism against journalists. So I agree with Kevin about this. And Ryan, let me tell you that I absolutely want to win this case. We absolutely want to win this case, not just for journalism, but for the right of the public to know, to have evidence, and to discover evidence of state criminality at the highest level, war crimes, torture, extrajudicial killings by drone. We absolutely want to win the right to reveal such state criminality and to remain free and safe. That's why I want to win, and I hope other journalists and activists and experts want to win this case with us.
So I want to thank everybody watching and thank all of you for being here. Again, Kevin Gosztola, you can find his work at Shadowproof. Chip Gibbons, thank you for organizing. His organization is Defending Rights and Dissent. And Stefania Maurizi, I'm looking forward to the English language version of your book. Thank all of you for being here. And I think you're right that the way to end this is pressure on the Justice Department, and everything else is going to take years and years and years, and we just might not have that much time.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.